Thank you, Val. Just can't help it. I really like that first hour with Eric. But you're moving from, because I said so, to this is the reason, telling a story too. Stories kind of cut through. They're like a different angle than reason. And they can be convincing in a different way that's really important. Last night, I listened in on Lavern's talk, the campfire talk. And it was so hard. He talked about, we got these emotions and these feelings inside of us, and they're just kind of fighting and roiling around. And if we can just get a word on it and sort of organize them and get them out, that sometimes is a really big step towards coming to a place of rest and peace. And I think one of the ways, how do you see somebody in a storm? Invite them. Don't insist, but invite them to put a word on it. So my mom was really good at that. And a few weeks ago, she invited people who were widows and widowers in the last year and a half to Sunday lunch. And she told each one of them, now we're going to eat, and then we're going to spend the afternoon. And anybody who wants to can just blow by blow, or however you want, talk about the last day of your loved one. And it was like, this is a little bit, what's going to happen? I was there, and we spent the whole afternoon, and people just, they talk, and they talk, and they talk. They've been waiting to be invited to talk about that hard day. It was really heartening to be there and be part of that. In the Gospel of John, in the first chapter, down there about verse 35, John the Baptist appears near Jesus, and he turns to his disciples and he says, "Behold the Lamb of God." Andrew and an unnamed second disciple of John the Baptist follow Jesus. Jesus notices that he's being trailed. And he turns to them, and he looks at them, and he says, well, I'll tell you what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, "What do you believe?" And he doesn't ask, "What do you know?" You know what he says? He says, "What do you want?" In other words, what do you desire? James K.A. Smith is about this tall, and his teeth are really crooked. But he has a big voice, and he writes books about this question. And the little book I bought, I can't read the 3-volume set. I just can't. I mean, I'm literary and all that, but it's too big. I bought the little condensed version, and it's called "You Are What You Love." He says in there, people sometimes talk about human beings as brains on a stick. Thinking people. Thinking man, let's just consider it that way. And he says, that's not the essence of being human. We'd like to say we are, and we really think that logic and reason is kind of the mark of a very well-developed and progressed human. And it might be at some level, but he says in the most essential way we are lovers. We desire things. He says, if I can figure out what you love, I know who you are, and I know where you're going. I can understand you. Now, I can tell you, I'm giving you a clue here for men. For men, you want to know what they love? Check where their eyes are. Because we just look, we point our faces towards what we're interested in and what we want. Now, women are more complicated. I'm just going to leave that. But this is a clue. What we love, what we desire, that's what we adore, and in essence, that's what we worship. James goes on to say, we cannot choose whether or not we worship. We only get to choose what we worship. He goes on, he has a lot of words to say, and they're inspiring and interesting, but the part I want yet is, our hearts are fickle. Our hearts are what desire. And we may resolve for a certain ideal, and we may do the discipline of learning to love and to follow that, but our hearts get sidetracked because there's a lot of people in this world who know the secret, and they want your heart. There's that siren song of Madison Avenue, and it's all around us in popular culture. And we are taught by those ads and all those subtle sort of things that influence us to respond to fear and out of greed and lust and envy. That's how stuff like SUVs and Bitcoin and deodorant and iPhone 13s are sold. We are appealed to at those base sort of emotional responses. And the first step towards wholeness is recognizing what's going on. So what's the antidote for that? What drives our desires? Maybe the story I've got will illustrate and illuminate that a little bit. But one other thing to keep in mind is we do not neglect the gathering, the assembling of ourselves together for a really important reason. We have to do with the world around us. That's part of where we are. We're not asked to be taken out of the world, but we are in that influence. And however well-meaning our desires, our hearts, our intentions are, we easily get drifted off. Our compass gets moved off, away. And so we come back and we intentionally tell the stories of faith and encourage each other with singing and with teaching and with conversations, and it gets our heart back to true north again. We adjust our compass and we go out and we're straight again, knowing full well that we'll need that again and again and again, because we're human and we're pliable. It means we can grow, but it also means we can stray. Am I coming through clear enough here? Because if you can't hear me, it just doesn't work. Because we don't do telepathy well yet. Good. My Aunt Ida is 3 years younger than my mom. She was always serious, reflective, and melancholy. My earliest memory of Aunt Ida, I was probably 3 years old or 2, or just at the beginning of when I can remember stuff. And we were back in Buchanan County, Iowa, at my grandfather and grandmother's house, and Ida was still a single young woman at home. And I loved all my aunties, and I didn't think of her as melancholy. She was just another beautiful woman in my life that I could come and ask for favors from as a tiny little boy. And I remember Sunday afternoon towards evening, and we're sitting in the living room, and I could tell something was coming down. I didn't know what it was, but people were, sitting up a little straighter, and they were expectant. And we were not disappointed. An open buggy drove in the driveway, tied up at the hitching rack, and Danny Gingrich got out. And I still remember him, and he kind of came up in a kind of mincing, nervous step. He had a poison green shirt on. And he was nervous. And he opened the little screen door on the porch, and he came in. He was there to pick up my Aunt Ida for their first date and take her to the singing. He had black hair, and he had really red cheeks, especially red when he was nervous like this. And he was small and wiry, like many of the Gingriches in Buchanan County. Well, apparently the date was successful because they went steady after that. That meant, he kept coming every Sunday to pick her up. And it wasn't long till my mom and dad got a wedding invitation. And we were excited. We lived in New Glarus at that time, and weddings are a big deal, and being invited was an honor. And so we hired a driver, and we were down there in 1963 it was, and we came and helped set up, get everything ready. And it was a wonderful wedding, and I don't remember the sermon. When you're 3, you block that stuff out. But I do remember the reception, because there were a lot of little children my size running around and enjoying each other, kind of like here. And the other thing I remember is there were some sort of decorations on the tables, and they were like BB-sized sort of hard sugar balls, I don't know, kind of pale green. And the boys, I know the boys here wouldn't do that, but they were like picking those out of the decorations, and they were winging them across the tables at each other. And every so often one would go ting, 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 ting on the hardwood floor. And I was on my hands and knees under the table, picking those up and putting them in my pocket. Yeah, because I thought they were just beautiful. Well, they all carried on, and then, not long after that, in New Glarus, well, I have to tell you just a word about the New Glarus church there. It was a new settlement of Amish people, my parents included, and they moved there because they couldn't afford land in Buchanan County, and this was cheap land. And so they were so pleased, and they brought their buggies and their horses and their plows and all kinds of stuff, but the part they didn't really get right was they didn't get their problem-solving techniques to come along. And that's often, those things reside in an older, wiser person. And they had a big, hard problem early on in the community, and it split the church right in half. Half was on one side, half was in the other. This would never happen with Mennonites, I know, but the church failed because of that. And it was failing at that time. And wouldn't you know, those Mennonites who lived up there by Muscadet found us. And Dean Hosteller invited us to come to church. And he said, I'll come pick you up. And I remember, him with his long black station wagon and us all ready to go. And we heard a sermon about grace that really impressed my mom and dad. And the singing was beautiful. It was 4-part harmony. We loved that. And my mom noticed that the men were kind to their children and to their wives. And she liked that. And my dad hated horses. So he saw people who spoke Pennsylvania German and looked like they were going to heaven, and they were farming with tractors. And he said, "Sign me up." My mom was concerned about relationships. She was not as quick, but it looked like the right thing to do. And it felt like the right thing. Didn't I think it was? Maybe not for all the right reasons. But it really sort of came to a point when it was time to go back to Buchanan County and celebrate Christmas with the aunts and uncles and the cousins. I still remember that trip, and I remember how stiff and distressed everyone was. We got through the day, but not without some pretty sharp words. It was kind of like a funeral. We'd arrived in a 1959 DeSoto that one of the neighbors helped my dad fix up and get going. And the aunties were tearful, and the uncles were stern. I mean, one of them said, "What do you think you are, the President of the United States, showing up here in a car?" On the way home, you have to understand, my dad is conflict avoidance. I mean, he's like an 11 on the scale. And he was like, "I don't know if we really want to ever come back here again. We'll just make friends with the Mennonites, and they'll be our family." My mom said, she has opinions. She said, "They're our relatives, and we're going to visit them twice a year, whether they like it or not." And that's why I grew up familiar with 88 of my 100 Ute cousins. The 12 I didn't get to know well were Danny and Ida's children. Ida was very reflective and concerned about doing exactly the right thing. And when Danny was ordained to be a deacon in the church, that made it even more intense for her, because you've got to be a perfect before God wife of a deacon. And Danny had to be a good example. And so they were very stern and very arm's length with our family. I always thought Danny was extremely severe and sour and had no sense of humor. And it wasn't long until they moved out of Buchanan County up to Augusta, Wisconsin, to get a little further away from the world and those influences. And we never saw them. The only way my mom could keep up with her sister Ida was through the budget. Now, not all of you know about the budget, but the budget is kind of like Amish Mennonite Facebook. Yeah, she'd read from one end to the other and keep track of people like Danny and Ida, because that was about the only way. There had been a circle letter that included all of my mom's brothers and sisters, but Ida felt that my mom was a bad enough influence, having gone to the Mennonites, that she should not, one of them had to drop out. She was the most severe one. So what they did, this was a Ute compromise. Utes don't often compromise. There were two circle letters now. One of them included everyone except Ida, and the other circle letter included everyone except my mom. And it kind of worked out. So we read about Danny and Ida's fortunes. They had a hard-scrabble dairy. They saved money and finally bought a farm. And then they had bad luck. Their cows got chronic wasting disease, and they had to dig a big hole and put them all in there. Not a good way to make payments, I'm telling you. And we read about how, the children got married one after the other. Of course, we never heard about it directly. We didn't get invited. But they did what they did and worked hard and had little band mills and quarter sawn lumber and, somehow made a go of it. We read once that Cousin David was out hunting with his bow. And apparently he'd been working late the night before, and he climbed up into that pine tree and he fell asleep. And he woke up over 20 feet down, crashed through the branches. He had a really hard fall. He broke his ankle, and he tore up his elbow, and he slashed himself with some broadheads, and he also broke some ribs. And it was mid-morning, and his wife knew, so there was a problem, because he was always home before then. And so she got the neighbors, and they went looking, and they finally found him, because he had, you don't tell anybody where your good spot is to hunt deer. Nobody knows. But they had an idea, and they found him crawling inch by inch out of the woods there. And I've talked with him, and he said, I can't open this arm the whole way. Do you know how tired you get if you have to go like a short arm and a long arm all day on a sawmill? My back hurts. Don't fall out of a tree was his point. Well, we saw that in the budget that one week, and the next week, Uncle David, David's namesake, in St. Ignatius, Montana, wrote in, and he said, "Nephew David, you should come out and hunt deer in Montana. Out here, they walk around on the ground. You don't have to climb 20 feet up into the trees to get them." That was his kind of humor. And it's the kind of thing that if you read the budget every week, you have all kinds of fun tit for tat and back and forth things going on there. We tried to visit Danny and Ida. Mom would write a letter and say when we're coming, we'd show up and they wouldn't be home. And we'd follow the buggy tracks, because my mom was persistent. And we'd ask the neighbors, and they said, well, they went that way. And we'd find them across the community at one of the kids' houses doing something, not very important, something. Well, we'd find them, and then we're like, yeah, we'd visit a while, and then we'd go. No invitations for anything. They don't say, put a word on it, or let's have a meal. We talked. And they can't help it. They're a little bit friendly, but it's still hard. It's still hard. It was painful, especially for my mom. Funerals were the only time we would actually see each other for many, many years. In June of 2012, our cousin John's Harley, age 44, died after a big battle with cancer. He left Frida, his wife, and 9 children, aged 3 through 19. And we all gathered for that funeral, Aunt Ida and Uncle Danny and everyone. And I still remember it. In Bloomfield, Iowa, at Uncle David's house, well, it had been, it was now Harley's house. They had a new machine shed, and that was full of the cousins. And they had a circus tent thing set up in the backyard that was full of people, and the house was full of people with, preachers in each spot, because they didn't have intercom systems. And out in the tin shed, Joseph Wagler was a preacher. And I remember him looking over to Frida and saying, don't second guess yourself. Don't worry. You did the best you knew. She was kind of alternative medicine. And people really criticized her. They should have gone to Ottumwa, to the cancer center, instead of to Tijuana. He said the real lesson here is we need to look at the end that happens to all of us, and we need to turn our faces towards eternity. Well, we cried and we buried, and then the Bloomfield ladies proceeded to feed all 1,200 of us. And I kind of worked my way up the line until I was right next to Uncle Danny, because I wanted to talk with him. And he sort of spotted me and was like, hey. And we got our little trays and we sat down, and I had questions for him because we had heard that he had an interesting offer on his farm. And I wanted some details. So he told me, he was like, yeah. The way it all worked out is we put down a well. And the guy who was drilling the well saw that we had special sand down underneath our land. He said most sand is pointy and sharp, kind of like little pyramids. Our sand was nice and round, like little tiny ball bearings. And he said, you know, I didn't know anything about this, but I looked in the encyclopedia set, and I found about this stuff, and the well driller told me too. He said, there used to be, people say there used to be glaciers, and they came down from Canada, ice sheets, and they pushed sandstone ahead of them for hundreds of miles over a long period of time, and it rolled all the sharp edges off the sand. And then where the glacier stopped, the ice stopped, there was an esker. It was this curvy, wiggly line with a big pile of ball-bearing sand. And it just so happens that my farm is right on an esker. There's not much sand like this in the world. And he also talked a little about his farm. He said, you know, I saved a long time to buy this farm. And I had 3 things I wanted in a farm. I wanted a trout stream on my farm, I wanted hills on my farm, and I wanted hardwoods. And my farm has hardwoods, and it has hills. It doesn't have a trout stream, but I hired a bulldozer, and it has a pond, and it has some nice bass in it. Almost as good. So I said, so what happened? And he said, well, word got out, and an agent showed up from one of those oil field supply places, and he wanted to buy our farm. Well, he didn't really want to buy it, he just wanted to lease it. And so what's he going to do with that? Well, they were going to strip mine it and get that sand out. That's what they wanted to do, because that sand is special. It's used for fracking. When you drill a well for oil, and the sandstone or shale is tight, they put explosives down and they kind of blast the shale, and then they pump Jello mixed with this brown sand down in there, and it goes out into the cracks, and it keeps the cracks open so the oil can keep flowing out. And if it was regular sand, the sand would just pack together and it would get plugged up right away. So they were kind of like, lots of money for this. I said, how much? And he said, well, he was talking about $15 million. Wow, that was a lot back then. It isn't now, but it was back then. So we were going on, and I was just like, whoa, that's really interesting. Well, we got interrupted, and it was Jonathan, age 10, Maria, age 11, and Jason, age 15, children of the bereaved. They came up to me and was like, Leroy, we want you to tell us Daily Bone. And I was like, this is your dad's funeral. Daily Bone's not appropriate. And they said, Leroy, it's the saddest day of our life. We need some joy. Oh, no. And I was just like, all right. It won't be Daily Bone, but gather your friends. I'll tell a story. And they gathered their friends, and I got over there, and there were benches and maples and a whole gaggle of kids, and they were just like, yes, I'm gonna have stories. So I told some stories that were not as inappropriate on a funeral day as Daily Bone. And pretty soon a bunch of adults were circling around us and listening in. And I can tell and look at people at the same time. It's a special multitasking thing I've learned from the women in my life. And I spotted my Aunt Ida on the edge of the crowd. And she was trying to figure out what was going on. And she was trying to elbow in and get closer. And she was listening. So I raised my voice because I wanted her to hear. And then I saw my mom work her way over right next to Aunt Ida. And then I saw Aunt Ida turn and look. And they had some words. You know, like, she said, and then, you know, they kept on listening a while. And later on, I asked my mom what was going on there. And she said, well, I was just standing there right by her, and Aunt Ida noticed me, my sister, and she said, she looked over, she looked me up and down, and she said, why are you wearing such a long dress? You would have had a fit if Mom would have made you wear a dress that long back when we were the young folks. My mom was caught off guard. That's very rare. It's hard to do that. The first thing that came out of her mouth was, well, I guess I'm repenting. Oh. And then she said, where did LeRoy learn to tell stories like that? And my mom was like, you know, again, off balance a little bit. And then Ida answered it for her. She said, he went to school, didn't he? He went to school to learn to tell stories. And Mom was like, yeah. And then the most amazing thing came out of Ida's mouth. She said, I want my children to hear that story that LeRoy's saying right now. And then my mom knew how to do. She can close a deal. She became my agent on the spot, and she said, well, as a matter of fact, he would like to do that. And you know what? The first week in October, that first weekend, that would be a perfect time to come up, and you could get all your children together, and we could have a story time. And they made the deal and they set the date before she could change her mind. That's how, that October, we found ourselves, my mom, my dad, and me, in a minivan driving all the way up from Kansas to Augusta, Wisconsin. We checked in with Uncle Mervyn, that's my dad's only brother who lives there, and Aunt Sarah. And then we headed over to Danny and Ida's farm. We still had a couple of hours before supper. So Aunt Ida and my mom and I went for a walk, and we walked out to the back pasture. And it was, I don't know, the light was just amazing. You people from up north here know this, but autumn light in the afternoon, it was golden. The sun was absolutely golden across the leaves and the grass. It felt magical. There were heifers in the pasture. They were nibbling at the grass and looking at us. And a couple of Percheron workhorses were lined up at their fence, and they all wanted us to come and scruff their big velvety noses. And we walked and we talked, and I saw the spot where they did the test well. And I scooped up a hand of sand. And I really couldn't tell, because I didn't have my glasses, that it was round or square or whatever. But I took some home to look at with a magnifying glass. And when we got back, we were walking into the backyard there to the house. We went past this maple tree. And it was funny because there were branches. There's a branch on, the branches on each side came out like this. And then they grew back into the trunk down here like this. And I was like, what's with that? I mean, it looked kind of like a heart shape with the two things, you know, like this. Oh, she said, I said, that's Danny. He's sentimental. You know, he had that prostate cancer, and it went wrong, and he nearly died. And then he went back to the hospital, and he knew he was going back again, and he was afraid he was going to die. And he went out, and he likes to trim trees and stuff, and he drilled 2 little holes, and he scraped, and he put those in there. He said he hopes it grows like that. And then, you know, he said to me, if I don't make it, you can come out here once in a while, look at that tree and remember me. No photographs, remember. But you can have a heart shape on the tree. Well, there was Danny on the front porch washing up at the pump. And I was like, hi Danny, you really have a beautiful farm. But there's a lot of beautiful farms in the community here. Why don't you just sell it and move to another farm? You know, practical and reasonable. And I think some of his neighbors, or not close neighbors, but distant neighbors thought the same thing. And he said, you know, I worked hard. We worked hard for this farm. We scrimped and we saved. And I love my farm. I love my animals. And I love the wildlife here. And the hills, and the hardwoods. And if they came in here, they'd dig that all away, and everything would be gone. And he said, my children live pretty much all the way around me here. I'm right in the middle. It couldn't be a better spot, because it's not too far to anybody's house. So even if we could move and all that, this is the best place for us. And then he said, the other thing is, if I sold the farm, they would put in floodlights, and there'd be earth movers, and dump trucks, and they'd be going 24/7, and the neighbors would hate me. Because I'd be like this big, noisy, ugly thing going on here. And he talked a little bit about the church. He said, you know, I'm a deacon. I am supposed to be a good example. And I want to do what's right. I don't want to be a horrible warning. And then he said something about, well, there's stuff that's more important than money. And he talked a little bit about how they decided. He said he knew he wasn't going to live long enough to spend $15 million, what with cancer and everything. So he got all of the children to come back and have a family powwow. And everybody got to talk. And I don't know what most of the cousins said, but one girl cousin said, she said, you know, every Monday morning I have a list. I make a list, you know, and through the week, and on Monday morning, my husband goes to town. And so far, we've always had enough money to buy everything on my list. So I guess we don't really need the money either. And I thought, wow, she didn't even go to high school. Got some wisdom there. I'm kind of proud of that girl cousin. So I said, the agent came, you know, and you said you're going to come back to him. What did he say when you told him no? We don't want to sell the farm for $15 million. Well, he said, I said, no, we decided we're not going to do it. And he said his mouth dropped open. And he just looked at me like I was crazy. And then he just like got his breath and he thought, this is what he's doing. He's holding out for more money. And he said, well, what about $17 million? And I had to tell him that would be even worse. So I got my answers pretty clear there, huh? We went on inside and had supper. And it was an amazing supper. It was like Amish comfort food. There were mashed potatoes with a lot of butter. And there was chicken noodle soup, thick chicken noodle soup. There was tapioca pudding. Ida had that fresh homemade bread that she made, you know, and her bread, just like my grandma's, always rose up and went out around the edges a little bit. And then when you sliced it, it had like elephant ears on each slice. It was so much fun to eat that bread. It was kind of like animal crackers, you know. This was the elephant bread. It made me very happy. Yeah, there was apple butter, and there was creamed sweet corn, and date pudding. And then there was dessert. There was angel food cake as light as air. And there were strawberries to put on that and thick cream. It was so good. Now I have to tell you, the way we were set up, there was a gap in the tables between where my mom and my dad and I were sitting and where Aunt Ida and Uncle Denny and one of the girls was sitting there. It was about a foot wide. It was a little wider than they do it in Buchanan County. It was to show ecclesiastical disapproval for the choices my mom and dad had made. But there was love and tenderness in the food. And there was gentleness and there was welcome in the conversation. And as soon as we were finished with supper, buggies started coming in the lane, one after the other. There were 7 sons and there were 5 daughters. And all of them, almost all of them, I think 11 of them were married, and they brought their children. And they gathered around, and there were 3 5-gallon buckets of popcorn for everyone. 2 of them we ate, and 1 of them we strewed all over the huge floor there. There were a bunch of children, and they had their toys in the corner, and they were going at it. And then Aunt Ida got up, and she said, my nephew LeRoy is here, and he's got some stories to tell us. And I was on, and they were all around me, and I started telling stories. And as I was going, the children were a little bit of a distraction, and there was this one I had spotted, and I found out his name was David. He was 2 years old, and he had red cheeks and a mop of black hair, and he had on a poison green dress. Little boys and little girls, all little children wear dresses until they're 2 years old in the most conservative Amish communities. My mom got into trouble because she made me a little suit, and I wore it before my 2nd birthday to church. You can picture me in a little dress, you know. Well, Jonathan was very feisty. He was living up to the Gingrich stereotype. And I heard a child gagging, just horrible gagging. I looked over, and he had one of his little girl cousins who was about half a head higher than him by the covering strings, and he was choking her. And she, well, it turns out she had a red ball he wanted, and she wouldn't let go. And he was working it, you know, and she did let go. And I saw an adult nearby just kind of reach over and peel his little fingers off of those covering strings and redirect him. And just by the way it was done, I knew that that was pretty common occurrence with him. Well, he ended up attacking my juggling balls when I was doing that, and I finally had him under my left arm here. And he liked that, and I just had to tell my story with my right arm. And I can do that. I can tell stories with one arm if I have to. Well, we worked through those stories, and they listened, and we talked, and then everybody headed home because you got to get your sleep so you can milk the cows in the morning. And after everybody was gone, Danny was like, LeRoy, I want to show you something. And he took me over to the kitchen cook stove, and he opened a big cupboard that was right beside, kind of behind it. And it was had some shelves with stuff in it, and then down below there was this big area, and it was a big wood box full of wood for the wood cook stove. And I looked up close and I saw, well, the whole wood box was just hanging there. And it had a rope, and there was this wooden pulley and a lag screw, and there was like a tow strap that went over to another pulley, and then it went down through a hole in the floor into the basement. I was like, oh, it looks like you can like load this up in the basement and crank it up to the top. He said, yeah. You know, ever since I don't have much strength anymore, and I can't carry wood up the steps. And so when we were like remodeling a little bit, I cut a hole out of the floor between the joists right here, and then we did this little cupboard in front of it to make it all look nice, and I made a wood box, and I put wheels on it, and I can just roll that across the basement floor to where the boys put the wood in through the window into the basement, load it up, roll it back, and then hook onto the handle and crank down there. I have a crank with a ratchet. until it's all the way up there. And then when Ida needs wood, she can just open the door and get it on. I thought, well, that's really neat. Did you design that yourself? And he said, yeah. Well, how? And then he said, by trial and error. Oh, well, you got to hear about the error. That's fun. Yeah, he said the first time he did it all, had it all right, and he loaded it up to make sure it was going to work right, and he cranked it up, and it kind of got stuck a little bit. He said, I think I made it too precise. And when it was loaded with wood, it flexed a little bit, and then it wouldn't fit through the hole in the floor. And so I just cranked harder. And apparently the screws I used in the handle were not long enough. And it ripped right out, and the whole load of wood came all the way down with a huge crash, totaled the wood box, broke the wheels off. I mean, I had to completely start over. Oh, so what did you do then? Well, I thought, big noise, a lot of dust. I'll just lie down flat on my back here on the floor and hold real still. Well, what happened then? Well, I was up in the kitchen and she heard the racket. What did she do? Well, she listened a little bit and then she said, Danny. And I didn't say anything. And then she said, Danny! And I still didn't say anything. And then she came over and she looked down the hole there and she saw me lying there. I said, what did she say then? She said, Danny, if you're not hurt, get up here right now. And then I knew that Denny, my serious, I mean, like stick in the mud, Uncle Denny had a wicked sense of humor. And it just changed everything for me right there. I was astonished. So we talked a while about some of his relatives and some of the mean tricks. They used to be practical jokers. And back in the 50s and 60s, if you did a practical joke, it meant that it hurt a lot to the person who was being joked on. So he told me jokes about that. And then it was time for bed, and we did our prayers, and we went upstairs. And I remember how quiet it was there. No sounds of anything, no electricity. It was dark. I could hear the big old grandfather clock in the living room downstairs. Tick, 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 tick. And I fell asleep, satisfied and happy. The next morning we got up early, and Aunt Ida had made pancakes for us. The kind where there's a lot of oil and there's kind of crispy edges. And she had peanut butter, homemade peanut butter, and homemade maple syrup. Peanut butter maple syrup the way God intended pancakes to be eaten. And just wonderful mint tea out of the garden to wash it down with. And when we were ready to leave, she came with a potted plant for my mom. It was a 12 Apostles plant. And it had a pedigree that went all the way back to Great Aunt Ida in Plain City, Ohio. My mom has that, and she's made slips, and I think all of my sisters have plants from that plant. Now, that's the way aunties show each other love, just in case you're wondering. Well, we said goodbye, and we headed out down County Road R towards La Crosse and I-35 and that long drive home to Kansas. And we traveled quietly for quite a while. My dad was kind of in a maple syrup stupor. And he was kind of mumbling to himself about tapioca pudding. He loves smooth, cold, sweet things. And my mom was like, that's not good for you, you know. So he indulged. He was really pleased. I was thinking about Danny the trickster, the deacon, the Amish deacon who could still play tricks on his wife. And he's about ready to die. And my mom was in the back seat and she was counting. She was saying something about 49. She was just mumbling and counting, and finally I said, Mom, what are you doing back there? What's 49? You have to understand my mom, she's a counter. When she sits in church, she counts things. She counts letters, and she has this weird little math game she plays, and she tries to reduce them all to 2. Don't ask me how it works. When I hold still, I just turn everything off, and rest it. She can't. She counts grandchildren and birthdays and ancestors, and she knows who's missing in the room in one look. I can't do that. I don't know how that works. But we all figured out that we couldn't pull things on Mom. She knew. She was back there counting, and she said, I just been figuring out, it's been 49 years since we were invited to have a meal with my sister. I was back at that wedding reception. I am so glad that I could live to see that moment of grace and forgiveness. And I'm not, I realize that there's still that foot of separation between the tables. And we're not going to be bosom buddies. But to recognize the Spirit of God in each one of us was an absolutely beautiful, gracious, wonderful thing. The other thing I'm so pleased to know is this other side of my Uncle Danny, that stern, humorless guy I had most of my life. I was wrong. He loves beauty. He's a naturalist. And he lives virtue. And he even has a wicked sense of humor. I was going to say something about making stories, but maybe I'll do that tomorrow. This is a heavy enough load for now. Thank you for listening.